So welcome everyone to CMMC Documentation Requirements with Vincent Scott from the Defense Cybersecurity Group. So we appreciate everyone joining us today. Just a couple items, introductions, housekeeping type of things. So I will be your host. My name is Aaron Troshnetz. I'm the General Manager, North America for Smithers Quality Assessments. For everyone's awareness, the chat has been disabled. However, we would encourage anyone that has any comments or questions to use the QA button. You can certainly submit your questions. We intend to spend some time at the conclusion of Vince's presentation addressing any of those items. And then the last item I would mention is after we exit the webinar, we will be sending out participants a brief survey. We would appreciate your feedback. We use this feedback actively with any of our next slate of webinars or these types of discussions. So a little bit about our presenter today. Again, Vincent Scott, founder and CEO of the Defense Cybersecurity Group. So Vince is a retired Navy cryptologist and serial entrepreneur who has started now 2 companies, 2 not-for-profits, and has more on the way. He currently serves as the CEO of Defense Cybersecurity Group, a cyber consulting company focused on the new DoD cyber requirements for the DIB, where he brings the cyber offensive mindset of his Navy career to cyber defense for a variety of U.S. companies. Vince is also a graduate of Oklahoma State Veteran Entrepreneurship Program and holds several cybersecurity certifications. So with that, I will turn it over to Vince. So Vince, you should be able to share now.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron, Scott. Really appreciate you guys having me on today. And I just want to, wait a minute, it's not sharing. Say how much I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. I think that, you know, CMMC and CMMC documentation. Oh, it displayed the wrong screen. Give me a second. My apologies. Rather than try and switch screens again, I'll just move the slides. It did, I do like talking about CMMC and particularly with a broad variety of businesses, because I think that everybody should be starting their journey today, right? The DoD, for anybody who doesn't realize
Hey Vince, I'm sorry to interrupt. We can just see actually the Smithers website, which is nice. But we don't see your deck at all if you were planning to have that up.
Oh, it looks like, Do you see the deck now?
Yeah, there you go.
How
just if you could just go
interesting
with
okay that must
be
be my technical challenge with the Zoom share. I apologize.
Oh, no worries.
Because the indication of the screen share is on my left screen, but it's actually displaying on my right screen. I've
run into that too.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, here's our agenda for today. As I said, I really do want to talk about CMMC with lots of different companies and you know, be able to share a little bit about what that journey looks like. So CMMC, as I think most people are aware, and I'm gonna cover just a little bit of the general background so that I can, we'll then move into the specifics of the documentation. But for anybody that doesn't know, right, the cybersecurity model, maturity model certification was actually published by the Department of Defense in the February of 2020 timeframe. There was an interim rule that came out for CMMC in the fall, December 1st timeframe of last year, that outline 3 rules in the future coming CMMC rule. Let me see here. Hold on just a second. I've got some background noise.
That's fine.
Apologize for that. So the DoD has put out CMMC as their future standard. And what they've said is that the CMMC ecosystem is starting now. They're going to start adding this to contracts. They had said as early as this year, although it hasn't come out as enforced this year yet, with a planned implementation date of 1 October 2025, so the start of fiscal year 2026, they want to have every company in the defense industrial base to have a CMMC certification. This is a maturity model certification. It has 5 levels. And most companies are going to be focused on CMMC level 3, which is a level at which you can handle controlled unclassified information. Now, the DoD in their talks about this have said they plan for most companies to only require level 1, and then a much smaller subset of companies to require level 3. But because of the way DoD handles and shares controlled unclassified information, my personal analysis and outlook on this is that a lot more companies are going to need to be level 3. And in fact, in the business community, when I talk to companies, most companies that I talk to who are talking about their certification and the future of CMMC believe that they are going to require a CMMC level 3 certification. And really, at level 1, that's supposed to be the 17 basic controls, not a lot of documentation required. But at level 3, that documentation burden becomes much larger. And as I go through my talk today, I'm going to be focused on CMMC level 3, right? I'm going to be looking at what the requirements are for that to meet that level, and really not talking about either level 1 or the higher levels 4 and 5. So what's the status of CMMC? Really quickly, right now, in my view, the CMMC implementation is behind. If you were watching this ecosystem closely from last year, really we were supposed to have training online as of the end of last year or early this year. That's really not the case. The CMMC ecosystem is going to require a number of certifications, not only for companies back to the Department of Defense, but for companies that are doing those assessments have to be certified, and the individuals who are doing those assessments have to be certified as well. So there's a number of different parts of the CMMC ecosystem that are going to require certifications, and even companies that are seeking certification can also participate in some of those certification courses, particularly certified CMMC certified professional, which is the baseline course for the CMMC ecosystem. I think if you're an organization seeking certification, that may be something you want to think about having someone go through. Those courses are supposed to be out by the end of this year, with the certification exams being available as of early next year, as of the last DoD CMMC town hall. We do expect some changes in the assessment methodology, but not changes in the underlying controls. So one of the biggest things that I hear today is, well, should I start? Well, the standard isn't even finalized. Well, we'll wait until later. I highly recommend that companies don't wait to start on this journey. There is a lot of work in the CMMC process. It is potentially very burdensome, and it is something that you do not want to be a crisis. There are not quickie, get me certified approaches to this, as you may see in some other industries or with other standards. With this standard, it's just not possible to say, well, I'll wait until somebody asks me for it and then we'll get certified in the next 30 days. That's not going to be possible. So what you don't want is to have your company or your business miss out on contract opportunities that maybe you've worked 2 years to prepare for, because as you've gotten down to potentially winning a government contract, now they come back and say, show me your certification. You say, I don't have one, let me get one. But there's no quickie getting to certified. You're going to have to put the law of the farm into place. You're going to have to plant those seeds early. You're going to have to grow the crops. You cannot jump just immediately to baking the bread. That's not the way this is going to work from a CMMC ecosystem perspective. So although there are potential future changes, and one of the things I would argue is that no standard out there anywhere is ever finished. There's always the next update, and there always will be the next update that's going to change and adjust, particularly in the cyber arena. As we all know, with information technology, that changes and updates very quickly. The standard is going to have to advance to keep up with those advancements, and so we can always expect changes. But I do think with the basic controls that we have outlined today that are in the CMMC assessment guides are going to stay pretty solid, and that companies should be working towards meeting the requirements under the CMMC standard now in order to be prepared in the future. How CMMC is different than Nist 800-171. So if you're familiar with compliance for cyber in the Department of Defense, Nist 800-171 has been talked about and is instantiated in the DFARS rules for a number of years, right? As of 1 January 2018, everyone was supposed to have fully implemented all 110 security controls outlined in Nist 800-171. The vast majority of companies have not completed that work, and many companies have not worked on that at all. CMMC completely adopts all 110 security controls in Nist 800-171 and adds an additional 20 controls plus additional documentation requirements onto the top of that. One of the critical pieces about CMMC and Nist 800-171, and in a way I think this is different for companies, is the use of Nist 800-171A, or the assessment guide for 171. So when I first looked at this, and as I go around talking to companies that have looked at this, I took Nist 800-171. We started to implement the security controls that are laid out in that. And I felt like we were in a pretty good place. When the assessment guides were published for CMMC, though, they completely adopted all of the assessment objectives out of Nist 800-171A. So each control is broken down into one or more assessment objectives, which is what the assessor is going to be looking for when they come to visit your company. Those assessment objectives expand the requirements. Now, that's not really what they were advertised to do, and that wasn't really the vision, I don't think. But as you get into it and you read the specifics of the assessment objectives, there are many places where you go, wow, I thought I was making the baseline control, but as you've broken this down into assessment objectives, there are some of these assessment objectives I'm not meeting. And what the DoD has said is, you must meet all the assessment objectives for a control in order for that control to be satisfied. So if it's got 5 objectives and you're missing 1, that's a not met. That is a very important detail. And so in your own compliance processes, if you're looking at this through the controls lens and saying, am I doing this, and feel pretty good, you need to break that down by assessment objectives and look through the assessment objective lens in order to determine whether or not you're going to look good from an assessment perspective. And one of the ways that those assessment objectives, in my view, kind of raise the bar is that they point to the requirement for specific documentation requirements in those assessment objectives that you'll have to meet. And there, my favorite word from assessment objectives is identify. So if you go through the list of assessment objectives for 171, there are a lot of them that say identify. This must be identified. Identified equals needs to be written down somewhere. So if you don't have that written down somewhere, then you need to go back and go, ooh, where do I write that? Where does that go into my documentation stack? That needs to be accounted for. Defined, specified, documented, those words are also all in there, and they all translate to where is this written down. So from a documentation perspective, by looking at it through the assessment objective lens, you actually find some additional requirements that need to be read in order for you to be ready for an assessment. Now, how does this relate to SPRS? So if you're not aware, SPRS is the Supplier Performance Risk System. This is a government database that government people have access to. And what they have added in the interim rule is a requirement for you as a company to conduct a basic self-assessment of yourself and put that score into the SPRS database. In order to do that, you have to request an account and you have to request the capability to do that from the government that's specific to your company. And then you have to input that information. There is a mechanism for you to just email that in. I highly recommend putting that information in yourself so you're not depending on a middleman to get it in there and you think you've submitted your stuff and the ball got dropped somewhere. But that basic self-assessment is different than CMMC. And that requirement for a basic self-assessment against the Nist 800-171 standard is present today. In fact, I had one of my BD guys send me a note this morning that says, hey, what's this basic self-assessment thing? It says here, we've got to have this done. And I was able to go, yep, put in on this date, here it's good, we're good. If you're a company out there, and I think particularly companies that don't have a lot of throughput for contracts, some smaller companies, you could easily stumble against this, and you don't want this to be a crisis. So there's a specific methodology for doing your basic self-assessment, and there's specific mechanisms for putting it in to the government's database. It is a requirement for letting all new contracts today from the Department of Defense. This is different than CMMC. I've actually heard some consultants talk about this in terms of CMMC and mix these two things together. CMMC is completely different than your basic self-assessment. They're not the same thing. There are different rules and DFARS. They both are cyber. Make sure that you have this SPRS entry done. To me, this is the wolf closest to the sled for all businesses in DoD cyber. If you haven't got this done, you shouldn't be worried about CMMC yet. Go get this done first. Now, I did mention on here that this SPRS entry is supposed to be valid only if you handle controlled unclassified information. What is uncontrolled unclassified information? How do I know that I have any? You know, how is it supposed to be marked from the government? All the subject of a separate webinar. But if you have CUI, this is a requirement. Now, the government contracting officers are not always terribly nuanced about this. So the word has gone out that this basic self-assessment is required. And I know of a number of companies who have been required by their contracting officers to put their SPRS score in, even when they think that it's not applicable to them because they don't process, control, or handle CUI. Whether or not you want to stand on principle and be able to tell your government client, you really don't have to do this because you really don't have CUI or not, probably depends on a lot of factors. From my personal perspective, I think that you should be prepared to submit this, if not already submit this, in order to present a crisis in the flow of a contract to your company, whether or not you think you have CUI. Technically, if you don't have CUI, you shouldn't be required. However, I know some contracting officers that are beating the door for it anyway. And I know of some primes who are insisting on this from their subs, even when they can't articulate how they have CUI. How you want to risk manage that is up to you as a company. This is a very doable thing, but it's up to you as a company on how you deal with that particular aspect of it. The one thing that I would say on this is there's not a lot of data out there. There's a score associated with this. 110 is your max score. Negative 203, I think it is your minimum score. So you can get a negative number on this. And I have read some information about a review of some of the information that's in SPRS that said the average score was negative 120. So if you have a bad score, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You probably have a lot of good company. You shouldn't be afraid of putting in a score that's low. Thus far, the DoD has not mandated any minimum score. They just have said you have to score yourself and you have to give them your score and you have to tell them when you're going to be 110 out of 110. I don't recommend being too liberal with your score. That potentially opens you up to a false claims act because you're making a statement to the government. And then if you have a problem later on and they come in and you said you were 110 and really you're a minus 120, that could be problematic, down the road for you. So I recommend, honesty in your submission to the government. Even if the score is low, though, don't be too concerned about that. I think there's a lot of low scores in the ecosystem, and I personally have absolutely seen that. So let's really get into the meat of CMMC documentation. So there are really 3 sets of maturity level documentation required in the CMMC standard that have nothing to do or not in Nist 800-171 at all. And these controls are numbered in the CMMC standard differently than they are in Nist 800-171 and differently than they are in Nist 853 for anybody who's familiar with that framework that the government uses for government IT. We invented yet another numbering scheme. So for example, the very first control of the very first domain access control is AC.1.001. They have taken these documentation ones and they've started at 999 and the numbers go down. So the first thing that's required at level 2 is policy, and you're required to have policy that covers every one of the 17 domains in CMMC. Now, many companies have policy, and we're kind of used to IT policy, security policy is out there in the general commercial ecosystem pretty well. But the CMMC is very specific. They have assessment objectives for policy. And so you need to make sure that your policy covers all of the domains. You can also, they don't require this to be documented in any particular way. So I like to say that I could have a 200-page policy that covers all of everything, or I could have 101-page policies. CMMC does not care, but everything needs to be covered, and every assessment objective that requires documentation needs to be covered in your documentation. And I'll talk a little bit more as we get down the stack here on my recommendations for how to address that. The next level down, also required at level 2, are practices. So practices are things you do and then you document that as a process. You're required to have this practice/process documentation that covers every control or security requirement in the CMMC documentation. So my recommendation on this is to actually divide your practice documents up by domain. So have 17 of them, one that covers each domain. And each one of those documents should encompass each one of the controls and how you're doing that control as a part of the documentation. And then the final one in this stack are plans, the 997 requirements. They are required at level 3. And really, the concept behind plan from Carnegie Mellon, and I've actually talked to a couple of the authors at Carnegie Mellon about this, and they've got some good videos on them out there if you haven't seen them. If you go Carnegie Mellon CMMC documentation, there's a video out there that comes up on that where the authors actually talk about what they were thinking about. This is how am I actually executing it is the vision for this. Unfortunately, as executed, and I've talked to many people when they actually get down to writing going, what's the difference between my practice and my plan and my policy? And where does one stop and the other one begin? And what level of detail do I need in each? It can be very confusing, and it can be hard, I think, to articulate a difference between when you say how I'm doing meeting the password complexity requirement from a practice perspective versus how you're meeting the password complexity requirement from a plan perspective. My approach to this has been to combine practices and plans into a single document for each domain. So still 17 documents, but there are 17 practice plan documents. That is not the only way to do this. That is just one approach. Again, I want to emphasize the important thing that every assessment objective is covered, not how you divide up your documentation. The assessors don't care. The accrediting body doesn't care. They don't care how you divide it up as long as it's all there. And indeed, for some companies with highly mature documentation, building your documentation stack around the CMMC standard may not make sense because you may have a bunch of stuff already signed, sealed, and delivered on the shelf that you want to use. And that's also okay. But again, you got to make sure everything's covered. So under the practice plan, by doing this as combined practice plans, I think that you alleviate some of the confusion. And so my recommendation is one policy that covers all 17 domains, and this is very high level. Hey, we're going to do risk management. Hey, we're going to do configuration management, whatever the domain is. And in general, here's a little bit about how we want this set up. Very high level policy document. Then for each domain, practice plan documents. And I recommend that those practice plan documents explicitly contain every control and explicitly contain every assessment objective and how you're doing it. So if you just copy the assessment objective and says, that's my practice, that's not going to be good enough. You have to say how you're doing that. But I do recommend including them. It makes sure that you didn't miss anything. And by having a stack that looks like that, you'll make sure that everything is covered. Now, if you already have, for those companies that have a mature documentation regimen already in place, right? You've already had a bunch of policies, you're ISO certified, you're CMMI certified, you've got aerospace certifications, whatever. So you have been forced to build a strong policy and procedure ecosystem already, and you've got a bunch of this stuff covered. If you're going to stick with that, I recommend developing a compliance matrix that maps every CMMC assessment objective to where that is covered in your documentation. Now, that seems like a lot of work, but in those places where we've gone through to do that, inevitably I have found, and I've worked with a couple of Fortune 500 bigger companies that already have very mature documentation stacks in place. When we've gone through that, we've found gaps, right? So that not only does that matrix help you, something you hand the assessor and say, hey, if you're because the assessors are going to go right down that list by domain, by assessment objective. You help to map them to where they can find that documentation in your documentation stack, particularly if it's not organized the same way that CMMC is. I think you do yourself a lot of favors by being prepared for the assessment, and I think you do a lot of yourself a lot of favors in dealing with the assessors, because you make their life easy. And anytime you make an assessor's life easy, you're making your life easier, because the quicker that you can get them through the process, the better, right? The last bit of advice on this is we talked about assessment objectives, and I hit it a couple of times. For plans, there are a series of assessment objectives that relate to plans. Practices, there's only a couple, and they're pretty straightforward. Plans are like A through G. There are a number of different things that need to be hit in plans. Those things include, how is something being funded? How many people are responsible for this? What tools are you using to meet these requirements? So there's some very specific things in the assessment objectives for plans. When you do your combined practice plan documents, my recommendation, include those assessment objectives, make sure you're writing to each one so that you make sure that they are clear. Now, in that stack, I have also, you can look at creating some reference documents that you, for example, the budget, right? So how much does, am I spending on this from a budget perspective? In most companies I see, hey, just see the IT department or the security budget for this. Trying to keep that in sort of your policy practice plan documentation stack, when that's going to dynamically update every year or sometimes every quarter, doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think referencing out to something like your budget is fine. There are times when you reference other documents as well, like maybe you've got a training plan, you want to reference that from a CMMC perspective and leverage those other things that exist. That's absolutely fine and doable, but make sure every assessment objective is covered. So there are some other documents that are required in accordance with the standard besides that policy, practice, and plan stack, which is pretty significant in itself. But your system security plan is still required, right? This was the foundational requirement under Nist 171. Your system should have a security plan, and that, if you use the Nist standard framework on it, listed every security control in Nist 800-171, all 110 of them, and was in a very standard format. I recommend continuing to use the Nist 800-171 standard format as written. Don't change it. Don't make it prettier. Just use what they've got. It's what the assessors are going to be used to seeing. I would add the additional 20 security controls from CMMC in the same format, actually. However, I think you can have less detail and sometimes in your system security plan by referencing this other CMMC required documentation. So I wouldn't try to duplicate everything you're doing in all this other documentation in your SSP, just reference it. And in some cases, that may be the only entry now in your SSP for a particular control is see my practice plan for this particular control and how I do it. It keeps you from having to update the SSP as often, and it keeps you from having the danger of having one thing written in your policy practice plan documentation and another thing written in your SSP, which is of course the kind of thing that always gets you highlighted by an assessor, right? Plan of action and milestones. So the DoD had came out a year ago and said that plan of actions and milestones would not be permitted. So under the current DFARS rules, right, you had to have implemented your Nist 800-171 controls, which included a system security plan, and anything that wasn't fully implemented was supposed to be on your plan of actions and milestones. That plan of actions and milestones in some ways is forbidden, and in other ways still needs to exist because the standard itself calls for plans of action as a required control in the standard. So you've been told you have to have one and you've been told you can't have one. My recommendation to this is use your plan of action and milestones as a continuous maturity document and be very clear about that and say, hey, we've implemented all the required controls, but either I'm trying to make those required controls implementations better, or I'm implementing, I'm working on level 4, we're going to add additional things, or I'm going to change out my privileged access management system, or whatever those things are that are improvements and advancement in your security program, you should keep your plan of action and milestones around. But for that advancement, at the time of an assessment, I don't have something implemented, but it's on my plan of actions and milestone. The DoD has said they're not going to allow that. Now, speculation is, and feedback to the DoD has been that, at CMMC level 3, I think I have 705 assessment objectives. If I've got to score a perfect 705 out of 705 every time I'm assessed, and score 100% on my test to pass, that's not a reasonable expectation for industry. That's certainly not the way that the DoD grades themselves, right, on this stuff. And so that's perhaps not a reasonable expectation. So there is certainly discussion inside the DoD about how they might allow plans of actions and milestone for controls that aren't implemented yet as a part of the assessment process. I think there's a lot of discussion about what that might look like and how that would be not made an open-ended, hey, we just put things on the POAM and say, yeah, I'm going to do it in 2189, and that's good enough. I'll get there in 200 years. Isn't going to be okay. So there's discussions inside the Pentagon, I think, about this. I expect plans of action to come back as allowed in some fashion for assessment objectives you perhaps have not met. But we don't know that right now. The official DoD
I don't know. It looks like we may have
action milestone.
connections. Never mind. Might have just been on my end. I lost you there for a second, Vince.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Scott. Plans of action. So plans of action are listed in the standard as are they different than plans of action and milestone? I don't think they are. I think you can combine those two things. Really, plans of action comes down to how do I identify shortfalls in my cybersecurity posture and am continuously working on it. And if you use the POA&M the way that I talked about, I think those two things are merged. And then the last thing I have in here for documents is minutes and records. So part of the challenge that we've got in CMMC is we're actually going to have to show maturity on these things. So it's not going to be enough to have a Word document that you printed off today that you were making modifications to on Sunday night before the assessor showed up and hand that to them and say, yeah, that's the way we do this. That's not going to be enough. One, approval of those documents is going to need to be shown. No one has said they had to be signed, but I think having them signed is a really good move. I think it's a good part of just making sure that there's not Word documents and the rules are changing on you because somebody went in there and edited it myself. I like to sign in PDF documents and have an official one. If it needs to be updated, let's officially update it. Most people don't do their documentation that way. To demonstrate that senior members of the organization are actually viewing and actually approving these documents. So having them signed is probably the easy button on how to do that. The other thing with this maturity and the minutes and records piece is you're going to have to show that you've been doing what you said you were doing over time. So in order to do that, you have to have some documentation. Now, some of that can be logs, right? You can show in your firewall logs, you can show in your SIM logs, or, other places that you can actually use physical logs in the systems for some aspects of that. I think there is a really good argument, though, for as you get together and meet on security topics and you're talking about your plan of action and milestones and how you're updating your DSSP and that kind of stuff, actually taking minutes of those meetings and recording those. So now one of the things that I've done as a best practice, and we didn't talk about my different hats. I actually serve as the chief security officer as well for a medium-sized defense contractor. We have a weekly security meeting. That weekly security meeting has an agenda. I pull it up. It's really last week's agenda. We modify it. We talk about what we did. Hey, what are we doing this week? I'm moving this. We're changing that. Yeah, we got the vol scan from this month and had a new thing. How are we going to deal with that? You know, that gets typed up in that, and I save it. I think that's a really great way. It's not hard. It doesn't cost me very much time to actually run that, and have some sort of regular drumbeat behind your security program where you show how you're managing this and how you're driving your security. I also use that weekly security working group meetings. There's requirements in the standard to periodically review controls. I think there's 3 or 4 that I've got that I actually check the box for that we are doing by recording those weekly security working group minutes. And it actually meets security controls that are required in accordance with the standard. So I think having your regular security meeting and recording the minutes of that regular security meeting can serve you really well as you drive this program forward. So with that, Aaron, Scott, I am ready for questions.
Excellent. So Vince, great insights. Really appreciate it. Maybe you could stop sharing, turn it back over. Excellent.
Yep. That's why I was looking for the button.
Thank you, sir. So we are available for questions or comments. I actually have 1 or 2 that just came in. So the first question I have, Vince, is the basic self-assessment that you mentioned. Is that in line with Nist 800-171?
It is. So there is a document that can be hard to dig out of the internet, but DCMA published a assessment methodology, and that assessment methodology aligns directly to Nist 800-171, and it provides you how you score that basic self-assessment. So anybody who wants to can go to my website, www.cybersecguru.com. I have give me your email and I'll give you a free spreadsheet. That free spreadsheet has a tab actually with that self-assessment and the scoring sort of automated with some rules and stuff already. So it all automatically adds up and stuff as a simple approach to that, because the DCMA document is a PDF. I've already spreadsheeted it for you. If anybody would like to have that, please feel free. I promise not to beat you up with 100 marketing emails. That's not the way that works. You get one thank you for me, and then pretty much, you know, I don't bug you very much after that. I'm a bad sales guy. But yes, there is that, and anybody who needs the link to that DCMA methodology for doing the basic self-assessment, I can provide it, or we could send it out as part of the notes.
Excellent. So the next question we have, it just came across, is the CMMC standard available now? If not, when is it expected?
It is available now. So the standard was actually published 1 February 2021, and it is available from the DoD website. Give me a second here. I'll pull it up, and I've got it. It's osd.mil/CMMC. They have a web page with facts and different documents. I recommend there's the standard, and then there are the assessment guides. I don't look at the standard anymore. I just look at the assessment guide because it has all the stuff in the standard plus the assessment objectives in it. So anybody who's looking to, hey, where's my baseline document? I think that the CMMC level 3 assessment guide is the thing to go to build your program off of.
I think that's a great tip, Vince, because frequently folks go to the standard, they miss the assessment piece, which you covered earlier, is so critical. There's no question there.
It definitely changed. The assessment objectives moved the bar some on some of these. And I was really surprised by that. I was a guy who was completely looking at 171 before and kind of, yeah, I've heard about the assessment guide, but yeah, whatever. And then they inflicted it on us and they made it the standard by putting it in the CMMC assessment guides. So, now that follows back to DFAR 7021 isn't going to say do 171. It now says do CMMC, and CMMC says you have to do all these assessment objectives. So that moved bar is now, valid, I think, from a regulatory perspective on DIB companies.
Absolutely. So we just had another question come across. I've been told that I should take clarification questions to CMMC AB, who tells me to go to DOD. Where do we get clarification on requirement scope? As the last FAQ update was December 2020.
Yes. So I've actually been pushing on the FAQ guys to publish an update. So I've had a conversation with some people in the chain of command there. I'm actually hopeful that they're going to take that on board and maybe get us an update soon. I think, the best place for clarifications is actually the DoD CIO's office, where, you have in DFARs, and this email is out there. It says, if you want an exception to the DFAR 7012 requirement, Nist 800-171, you have to email DoD CIOs. They actually are, I've sent them a number of questions. I've gotten answers to those questions. Now, sometimes I have had to go back with them and said, no, really, you didn't answer the question. No, really, and I really want an answer to the question. But they, I've had good interaction with them and I've gotten responses and I haven't gotten talked to the hand. So I props to the DoD CIO guys who I think really are trying. And I think they're getting a lot of questions that they didn't expect because of CMMC. But I recommend, if you have specific questions from a DoD perspective, that is a place to go that is relatively responsive. And because that exists in DFARs, the answer you get back from them in email can be used in an assessment, in my view. Hey, the standard says I go here to ask for exceptions or clarifications. I did. They gave me this answer and said, yeah, the way I've implemented this is okay. And save, that becomes solid gold that you save from when an assessor comes by. That's hasn't been published in like how we do a CMMC assessments. That guide is not out yet, the CMMC assessment process. But certainly I, as a future assessor, that would be something that I would consider to be absolutely valid, because it links directly back to DFAR's regulation, says email those guys with questions and exceptions. Okay, I did that, and I got something from them, and it says this.
Okay.
We've done that for a couple of my clients. I've actually sent stuff in where we had questions and gotten answers back, and I'm like, here's your answer. They said this was good. Okay, save it.
So maybe that's something we can follow up with after the webinar, because kind of a follow-up to that question. I've emailed the DoD and they said they won't answer them. I'll revisit the email, as I don't know. I use the DoD CIO, which I believe is called out in the DFARS document. So maybe there's a link or a resource we can get out to folks on that.
Yeah, I certainly can do that, Aaron. I've got the email address that I have used for that, where I've gotten responses, and I think I did get it out of 7012 though.
Okay.
As the baseline. Now, another thing that I personally am a part, I'm personally a part of the DIB Small Business Working Group, which always has DoD members present. And it's not an official channel like the CIO email address is, but there's certainly mechanisms to insert additional questions back into the DoD process via that means.
Okay, excellent. So next question we have, can Vince elaborate on what to look out for when looking to engage registered CMMC consultants or auditors?
Sure. So the biggest thing that I tell companies, if somebody tells you that they've got a tool that's going to get you CMMC compliant in 30 days, don't work with that company. It's not, because there isn't a 30-day answer to this. Not really. They may be able to do something for you in 30 days and implement a GRC tool or something like that, but that's not going to make you compliant. The assessor is not going to care if you have a GRC tool to track all this stuff, right? people that promise this a really quick fix to this, I think that's disingenuous, because I really don't believe that that's the case. In my chief security officer hat, we've been working for 2 solid years on this. I mean, we've been working. I can tell you, we were just talking about having my 1-year anniversary of my security working group. Every week we meet, we keep minutes, and I'm just getting to the point where I feel like we're in pretty good shape. And it was non-trivial to get to that point, right? We uplifted our firewall stack. We've implemented new tools. We implemented a SIM. We've done a bunch of stuff to make sure we're meeting all the requirements. And we've written probably 200 pages of documentation, which I know is people go about that. But if you start writing down every assessment objective of the 705 and writing to each assessment objective how you're meeting it, that gets pretty meaty pretty quick. So I think that there's absolutely a slow and steady wins the race on this. Assessors are not going to show up at your company tomorrow. The assessment community is not ready for that. They're a little bit behind from a DoD perspective. Utilize that time well to start this journey and be making your company more mature from a cybersecurity perspective. Not only does that move you towards the compliance that you need to have in the future, but really, underlying this, and this is an interesting point of debate, I think, in the professional community at times, is CMMC going to help it all? I advocate to some companies, use CMMC as a mechanism, as a lever to get you where you need to be from a cyber perspective. I know a bunch of security professionals who are frustrated that they can't get support for the things that they know need to be done in their company. CMMC is a great lever. Hey, these guys are going to come. They're going to assess us, boss. They're going to be looking at our stuff, and I've got to be able to prove to them that we're doing this. We're not doing it today, so we got to go do it, right? Yeah, there's a lot of documentation to it, but use the CMMC lever well.
Excellent. So I think we got time for maybe 1 or 2 more. The next one we have here is Vincent. How would you assess a SaaS product for access control? SaaS products being able to sign in from anywhere and any computer.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of detail needed in that. It depends, which is of course the evil auditor's standard answer. But the DoD has been very strong, and the regulation is very strong about cloud products needing to have FedRAMP certification. I think there's some differences in different assessors in the community would be more draconian about that than others. Access control is very important because it potentially gives access to CUI. And when we talk about scoping in the CMMC regulation, and we don't have the scoping guide yet, but we do have some things, right? We have the DFARS regulation that says process, store, transmit CUI. And then Nist 800-171 expanded the scope. And again, I think that was unfair, but it's what it's done, and added the phrase or provide security for. So right now, from a scoping perspective, what we know about this is if it process, handles, or stores CUI or provides security for CUI, it's supposed to be in scope for level 3. So a access control SaaS service is probably in scope as providing security for CUI. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that would mean you probably need a FedRAMP certified instance if you're going to allow access to the environment based on that software as a service.
Excellent. So one last question. We'll certainly follow up with the handful of others that we have here. But I think a good question to end with, how deep do these requirements go? Just top level contracts or down through sub-suppliers?
Oh, down through sub-suppliers, absolutely. So the requirement in 7021 from a DFARS perspective, so the DFARS clause for CMMC that isn't inflicted on many people yet, but 7021 says that it has to be flowed down in all instances in which, I think in all instances, I was going to say CUI was involved, but no, it's all instances other than COTS. So pretty much The entire supply chain is supposed to be subject to that. Now, I think the deeper you get in the supply chain, the less visibility they have, and the harder that is to understand whether or not this really applies, or did it really get flowed down, et cetera. If you could start getting into fourth or fifth tier subs, who knows? I certainly think at first tier subs definitely are going to see this. Second tier and below, it potentially applies. But what you have right now is you have a lot of primes, particularly large primes, who know that this is coming, and they're going to come and say, show me your certificate down the road. The day is coming where and some of them have already started to ask, and you're like, no, you can't get certified yet. I've seen that happen where a contracting officer says, show me your CMMC certification. There are none of those yet. No one has done this yet. but that day will come when you need to have that.
Certainly the days of self-attestation are behind us, no question. So what we'll do now, I see a couple other questions. We will certainly follow up with that post session, but I kind of want to wrap up here. So we will be making this presentation available via the www.smithers.com website. Everyone who's registered will be notified when the video is available. As mentioned previously, when this webinar ends, you will be directed to a brief survey. As always, feedback is appreciated. We use it as inputs for any kind of future sessions. Once again, I'd like to thank Vince Scott for his time today. I think there was a tremendous amount of insights that Vince offered, and we certainly appreciate, Vince, you making the time for this session. So with that, I'll thank everyone for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great day and a great weekend.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
Excellent.
Vince.
Thanks, everybody.